All right.
So even though the intro is still on the way, I think we should get cracking. I'm freezing, so I'm going to actually stay locked up. Yeah.
Indonesia is still in your system.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't want to let go. It's like, oh. Great to see everybody. Let me share my screen. John, can you see a slide?
Not yet.
No?
Doesn't seem like it.
Wrong screen. Try again.
I think if you share the left screen, it should work.
Otherwise, you close as many windows as you can, and then the right one super.
Just share this
Then
one,
share it.
and then you
Yeah,
can
no.
this one.
How about now?
Yeah,
Good.
yeah, I can see that now.
Great, thanks for coming on kind of a short notice. I mean, I planted this little seed, talking with you both very early on, but actually, as I mentioned in the little sort of outline, I've changed my ideas quite a bit, and it would be lovely to kind of start afresh and think afresh and get your take on these things. So we have today, still waiting for Esther and Anitra, both of whom, sadly enough, were my former employers, and both are late, so this is terrible.
They're paying you back some bill.
Yeah.
You just don't know which one.
Let's go through it very quickly. Chile, of course, everybody knows. This is all TU Delft, will go very quickly. Alex, welcome. So Esther is just graduated, but has been working with me on the Java project. Now she's not here, I can say it, doing absolutely wonderful work. John and I have been working together on several projects in Indonesia, but also in China. He is the program manager of architecture at RMIT, but actually the programs, the studios we've been running have been quite large in scope and scale. Anitra is very interesting. She started as an architect with me in China and felt maybe I put her off. She felt this is not for me, and she went to do urban development at LSE and did her PhD there, and now just starting at IHS in
So she's
Rotterdam.
got in mind, actually. Well,
Yeah.
I'm working with IHS people, but
Right.
several of them. I have
She's
some.
just starting, and I think it's a great asset for them. And she moved into my mom's flat, so there's an interesting thoughts. Tanea is also running a little bit late, but she should be popping in shortly. You all know, so we can. And Martin is just my oldest friend in this gang, meaning our relationship is the longest. And Gregory, the shortest. I think we've just met online, and I'm very, very proud to have you here.
Thanks.
Rushing through this, so I am normally, as most of you know, I'm not an academic in the traditional sense, but now since very recently, I guess I am. Yeah, I started at Xianjiao Liverpool University in Suzhou, but until now I've been quite comfortable working from my own little research platform, the Dynamic City Foundation. I'm going to throw a few ideas out there just to get the juices flowing. Esther, please, take a seat. I already introduced you, so we're going to skip that, yeah. So, I have been having an observation that I think many have echoed, that there's this very rather fundamental schism in the discipline between theory and practice, and arguably between sort of a global understanding of what the practice is versus a local one, which in this case you could kind of bulge together as formal versus informal, top down versus bottom up. In China, it's very much about nation building, whereas, for instance, in the Dakota, it's very much about community building, if you want to use that term. And it seems to me that these are rather incompatible, and certainly you're likely going to be in one team or the other, and there's very little of overlap, and there's very little by means of joining these two in some sort of what I believe is necessary, some sort of integrated approach. So the future is very much open-ended and unclear. We were just talking about Holland, which is a unique condition, because maybe it's small, and because it's a pretty well-established democracy, etc., and affluent. We have in place all these. I couldn't bring myself to translate, but we have all these really wonderful structures and mechanisms in place to do something that is probably called integrated planning. From I want to use one term, omgevingsvisie. Is there even a word for that in English? I don't think so. Structural vision, regional structural planning, something along these lines. And it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that's the point. The terms we're using, even like favelas and slums, defining the terms and then actually translating ideas into terms that people can understand is also part of the problem.
Right.
Where we touch on the core of anthropology here. Epic versus ethic.
Well, that's a good point. I'm in that sense really kind of traditional maybe planner by trade, which means that I tend to only think in sort of the physicality of the city and not in the socioeconomic and ecological side of it. And that's probably where the answer lies in these questions. So I quickly drafted this very sort of simplistic model where maybe these are the main actors when it comes to larger scale problems. And us academics should be sort of somewhat disconnected, yet at the center of all this, trying to observe what's going on, trying to distill values and principles. That's where my personal kind of conundrum arises from, which is this idea: are we still able to actually come up with universal principles? Are there principles that even transcend borders and regions and territories and conditions, right? So, not to take up any more time, but some slides just to get the juices flowing. Even the most fundamental question of is a city good or bad, it seems to be almost impossible to answer. I usually show this slide, that seems very obvious. The Chinese model is kind of frowned upon, but actually it has many really powerful assets to it. It's kind of very affordable, it's extremely fast, etc., etc. So there's a schism that is defining good and bad, but actually in reality the worst cities tend to be the most exciting and maybe the most interesting, and vice versa, right? The most ideal cities are tedious and boring and in that sense actually bad. And then the weird thing is we need to, talking with Anitra, we need to, she reminded me, there is some sort of a trajectory when you're dealing with this. That's also in the introduction, right? This idea that, we all believe we're all moving forwards. In the Dutch there's a beautiful phrase, the vaart der volk, this idea.
The race of the peoples.
Yeah, exactly. That we are collectively progressing to some sort of collective goal, and of course that's not the case at all. China is reinventing itself. The Chinese modernity is completely unique from Western modernity. So that all boils down to this kind of simple conclusion: theory is at odds with the practice. I love showing this in interest from LSE, and I love these guys from LSE. We were taking part with Ricky Burdett in Quito, and he showed this slide. Oh yeah, we've boiled it down. We solved planning. Right? Okay, great, show me. Yeah, it's about density and complexity, porosity and adaptability and accretion over time. Done. Check, please. Okay, and I was like, yeah, but actually in China, that means actually you're creating really scattered. You're dealing with a scattered environment. You're creating very simplistic settings with these large, kind of monofunctional, repetitive solutions. Porosity and adaptability? I don't think so. These solutions are internalized and they're very much sclerotic and heavy-handed. Right, and accretion over time, no. The good thing is that they can respond instantly, and then it stops changing. It's kind of rigid, right? So the theory is sounds wonderful, but it's kind of panda principles that I used to call them. You know, kind of very cuddly, lovely, and delightful, but rather meaningless. So what is left then? Maybe there are no principles, or maybe there are still some things we can hold on to. So on the one hand, I suggested maybe the physicality of the city has still some sort of universal traits to it. Dynamics, they will change. The morphology, I called it Noah plane meets grid or something like that. That the network quality of cities seems to be relatively universal. And some sort of urban gravity, urban geography's first law, something that there is a transactional component to it that is quite universal. And now, of course, global challenges, on the other hand, make it very much that we need to think about these things both collectively and across scales. But these models don't seem to be particularly effective. All we can do is break down into really intricate kind of lists, ever longer extending lists of a to-do list and a list of principles, etc., which are heavily politicized and mediated over years and years and years of talking and negotiating. So you really wonder if that's the way to go. The opposite is the Chinese way, where we say, okay, we have the answer. This is Xiong'an, the new city of the future. Only it morphologically looks exactly like everything we've seen before, right? And that's the model that China is now, sorry Chile.
You're not responsible for a whole state, right?
Well, as you know, I'm really objective towards China. There's really great and really dubious aspects, but it is in any case transporting this model across the globe over already 100 countries, right? And doing so rather effectively. At the same time, there's an organic component that seems to be fairly universal. The roads that are expanding, the organic growth tendencies of the city itself. These are the roads in different, I mapped them for pretty much every continent, which maybe could be broken down in some sort of doom dream scenario. On the one hand, fragmentation and dispersion, versus on the other hand, a sort of contiguous, compact solution, road proliferation versus integrated planning. It is very simplistically, but again, you know, I fall in my own trap where I want to describe these principles and then it doesn't really hold together. Like this is Chongqing and Chengdu in 1992, and this is it in 2007. This kind of really, and everything is planned, right? Every square meter within this map is planned and rubber stamped, and yet it's clearly kind of organic in nature. So yeah, there are some universal traits and new technologies that are universally adopted, e-commerce, etc. Global regions, metropolitan regions, and then finally sort of a natural underlayer. This is the I call them the kind capillary surface water systems of where really the globe. This is China, of course, but there's India, and it goes on and on. So some sort of red, green, blue. For me, that means city, agricultural landscapes, and natural landscapes that need to be considered somehow as an integrated system. So here are my questions. Is there still room for either some sort of generic principled approach, or does it have to be all specific? Or is it like my bar here suggests maybe there's some sort of gliding scale, and how do we deal with that, right? Or maybe it's about principle versus process, right? So versus model versus observation, and being very kind of generic or very context sensitive. That's my slides. The questions are open-ended and poorly defined, as Esther mentioned in the group chat, and Anitra asserts as well. And that's kind of the mission of today. How do we even begin to tackle this? Now, the stupid thing is that all of you have dealt with this project, with this larger project, much longer than I have, and you already have generated a lot of insight and answers. Actually, Martin wrote a whole book about it, and I didn't know that until I called it. He was like, "Oh, you mean this?" I was like, "Yeah, that exactly." And I haven't had time to read it, but could we start with this gliding scale? If is there maybe and maybe we could start with you, Martin. Like, is this a nice way of looking at it, or is there real room for solutions, principles?
Hard to begin somewhere. I would say, from a social science point of view, the transfer of ideas on architecture and urbanism is a specific case, or a specific, species of a more general genus, which is, some people call it policy mobility, some people call it policy transfer or institutional transplantation. So in most social sciences, but actually even in engineering, when it comes to standards, you have this happening. And it's mostly driven by power. So, we may think, oh, what is a good idea for a modern urbanist now to embrace? The reality, why was Western architecture dominant in previous decades, and why is Chinese architecture or urbanism dominant now? It all has to do with power. So those who are powerful like to see themselves replicated into something or somewhere else. It's a very cynical worldview, maybe, but this is what I see as a political scientist. People want to see themselves replicated somewhere else.
Does that immediately undermine the entire discipline?
Well, at least the primary ethical standpoint of what. Well, you can still ask yourself, what is the right thing to do? What leads to a human scale society? You can still ask yourself that question. And there may be political or economic leaders who somewhere deep in the back of their minds also cherish such questions. But our influence on that is marginal. That is maybe a disclaimer in advance.
Yeah, please.
I was still going to say something about the generic versus specific. When it comes to adopting ideas from elsewhere, because in some cases it is imposed. Not that imposed ideas are always effective. Sometimes actually they don't connect well with the local context and they are not picked up very effectively, and then they're resisted. So it's not that when you have the power you subject, others submit, and you get things exactly your way. It's much more complicated than that. But let's assume that it's more voluntary adoption. Most adoption is a bit in the middle between enforced and voluntary. But let's assume that it's voluntary. Then, if societies are very different, then it is still very fruitful to look at general principles. So, what kind of thing are we trying to achieve here, and how can this be adopted? But then, when it comes to the details, I think local actors should really play their role when fleshing it out. because then you are more certain that it will connect with local context. If you allow the donor of the idea also to flesh it out in detail, then the likelihood of a mismatch is far higher. So the involvement of local actors in the adoption process, even when it is imposed, remains always important.
So I see a simple model. You take a Western concept, you export it, and then hope that local actors can chew on it, regurgitate it, make it their own, and then apply it.
Actually, that is, I was a kind of an advisor for the Chinese Academy of Urban Planning and Design, Shenzhen branch, and they were dealing with the export of Chinese ideas and legal frameworks to Belt and Road countries. But they were somehow, well, it was a little bit broad brush, but still they had some level of awareness that, you know, we should not be repeating the same mistakes that previous Western colonial powers made. So how can we make sure that it connects with the local context? So they were asking me for advice on how can we make sure that the planning standards, the legislative framework is going to be working for them and for us to replicate our Chinese standards so that doing business with them and selling trains is easier for them because it will work for them better.
Wow, that's amazing.
That's at least more forward-looking than colonial powers used to do. It's very far from perfect in my view, but it at least shows awareness that there is an aspect of local adoption. Yeah.
In a nutshell, what did you advise them?
Yeah, that's a presentation in itself. Let's give the floor to others.
Okay, thank you. That's enlightening. Shall we go like this and then virtually and then?
May I
Please
jump
jump
on
on,
first,
yeah,
because
of
I
course,
need,
yeah,
I, need
that's
to,
right.
I need to leave earlier. Apologies, I had a mix-up with my
Absolutely.
in my agenda, so I thought we start earlier and finish earlier. So, two things. The one thing is just to reinforce this traveling of ideas or best practices. I think is an idea that is that failed to do a certain idea exactly about what you described. You're much more the expert. I'm not gonna add it. But what I found inspiring from the maps that you showed is actually that there seems to be something underneath our planning and policy activities, namely something that is related to complexity, to emergence of structures, and so on. And that seems to be more common and global than we often assume. So I think if you're looking at the urban development in China, give it another 20, 30 years, probably, then we will find similar principles of self-organizations, of emergence, of patterns, of transformation, because we are not yet to 3-4 redevelopment phases, being not an expert on Chinese urbanization at all. But I think that is something that is worth looking at and describing. And then there is indeed the difficulty how to relate this to planning, to design, to policy making. Because well,
I love that.
so that's just
Because that would imply that maybe there's a loophole where we could, if by understanding, let's say, complex adaptive systems, we could reclaim our role in the process. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not sure if reclaiming is. I think we could be aware what our role is, and play a different role in the process. I'm not sure about reclaiming. I think this reclaiming is a bit of a modernist.
At some point we could say something and not anymore.
I think that indeed, because that's kind of I would call it a modernist way of thinking, that we as planners do things instead of realizing that our position is rather in enabling people and organizing discourses and adding our qualities, which is with dealing space, with prospecting spatial qualities and being able to prospect certain transitions and things that go on bringing it into the discussion, because that's, and then I'm stopping, that leads back to the power discussion. Because the power of image, the power of narrative, the power of who is able to understand and communicate with narratives, images, and different versions of the futures is the crucial one. So this is very much a question of empowerment, of democracy, as well. So this is
okay. Okay. Do you have a, because yeah, I'm not used to democracy, so do you have an example maybe of how, are there good case studies how complexity is being engineered? I know one amazing project by the one person who couldn't be here, who's really from the practice side, Eric Freiter, just a wonderful, wonderful planner, right? And they've done this kind of complex systems project here for the Rotterdam Delta.
no, I could not give you a real project in this sense, but there are initiatives, and I lost it. There is this UN. Sorry, give me a minute. I'll look it up. What I mean.
But it does feel, it makes me quite hopeful because, you know, for instance, Esther and I, we've been working with big data, and then that kind of taps into emerging systems, and that I do like the word reclaim. That does give me hope to kind of at least reframe our discipline, our job. What do you think, Esther? You were quite critical about how we framed the questions.
Well, in fact, I was like bringing the project that could like bring a similar discussion like this. Because like, I really agree with the power relationship, and as like in China, we also promoting and selling our product of city as a model to the other country, for example, Indonesia. But I also found out that it's also framed as the global theory, like the eco city or something like this, some like sustainability. But in fact, if you go inside of the policy, it's really related to the economic policies as well. And also, I don't know about the Western countries, for the Asian countries, we're really optimistic for the technology for building the city. They believe that the technology will solve everything, but it's not related to the quality of the space, and it's not our role to design the city as the designer. So I was like wondering for the discussion, like how we reframe our role as a designer when interacting in this like process of building not the small scale, but such like big scale, the new capital or new development, because it's mostly top-down approach, not the bottom-up as we want, and it's not the citizen involvement as we pursue. So I was wondering.
Yeah, that's an amazing point. Like, so Korea does it, China does it, Indonesia is now moving its capital with the help of SOM and McKinsey and others. But your point, you called it the quality of space. I think that's such a great term. We've been discussing that as well, but this kind of value component, which to me is still is a difficult concept to grasp, is there, especially when it's ultimately it's framed as a technocratic solution, right? Are there ways of monitoring, measuring these kind of human values in these kind of really technocratic solutions?
Yeah.
You either one of you, but I know you have a lot of ideas on this topic.
Yeah, maybe we can firstly finish.
No,
I just agree with this observation. And indeed, I think this also reflects a missing discussion that is among all the stakeholders in the society on the future scenarios that is more desirable for everybody. I think this quality of space is part of it, but also it includes many other aspects that is related to, for example, sustainability. So we don't have a common or good understanding of sustainability, and also how this is translated into different contexts. So we agree the SDGs, these big principles, but how it is translated into the local context, I think we lack such kind of agreements, especially in the local context. That's why it's then eventually the way the cities are being developed or redeveloped is really dominated by the power. Yeah, because of lacking of such common understanding. Yeah, then the power make more influence in the choices.
So with John, we've been framing this as a collision of global, local, but also of, let's say, top-down, bottom-up, which in the case of Indonesia, where we've been working, it really comes to a head, right? Where we see these, so you made a beautiful presentation on this, where you see these big interventions of tollways, of airports, of new harbors that are kind of bluntly super projected onto really intricate, organic, local systems, right? Did we, John, have we come to some sort of insight on what that collision will bring for the future?
Insight is a risky promise. I think the point that we're at, or where we got to, was that it's not so linear in the case of Indonesia. I mean, the interesting thing about Indonesia, and I'm not an expert, you've actually been there. In fact, I thought you were there until you connected to this call. Is that the sort of expectation, and certainly the Chinese experience of urbanization would suggest that that there would be a sort of collision and a kind of landing of global capital in Indonesia and a radical reformation of the landscape. But my understanding of what we observed there was that it was a lot more messy. There's a lot more a sort of messy convergence between, I guess we'd call global actors and the kind of the implications of international power and kind of grassroots forces, not necessarily planning forces, but perhaps economic forces and social forces. Because as we sort of discussed, there is an urbanization in place there, which is in spite of perhaps some of the things that we would expect to happen and has happened in other countries.
Right. Well, the weird thing is, like having seen it now firsthand, the things they've built, the infrastructure is rather attractive. They've done a pretty good job, which is, you almost want to be cynical about it, right? Like, hey, it's supposed to be messy, and it is very messy, but that little corridor you're on has slick new asphalt, a beautiful tarmac, and people are obviously drawn to that, right? So the contrast gets even harsher, where you have this new world, the new world order of the tarmac, and then next to it is just absolute organic mayhem of little intricate developments.
But it sounds like Brasilia.
Yeah, very much so, yeah. Very much so.
But in the long run, it will never become a very popular capital. And I think Kuala Lumpur had also.
But this is island wide. Like this is what's happening across Java, and to your point, Martin, like that makes this power dynamic, this kind of top-down, kind of centralized power, very appealing, not just to the people in power, but even to people, the user.
Yeah, you get clarity with it. And I mean, in Kuala Lumpur, Putrajaya, but there was a very political agenda there. They wanted a place where you couldn't protest. So if you want to make political protests in Malaysia, you don't go to where the power is, you go to where the colonial power used to be, because that was easy to get to, well connected,
right,
and has these statement buildings.
Brave the British.
Yeah, but they're no longer there, so they're safe off from Putrajaya where nobody can get to them. So.
Right. I saw you typing really frantically.
Yeah, because I was trying to remember what I'm saying. So these have raised really interesting points. Power makes these choices for whatever reason, and they often have very goals that they like to see as measurable because they've got spreadsheets and so how much money, how fast, etc. So a way of measuring success in these techno spaces would be to concentrate on epiphenomena, not happiness per se. I think flourishing is a better. So just kind of, it's not the thing itself, it's what did it allow to flourish, and are people flourishing? Is this, did the tide rise or raise all the boats, or whatever. Looking back to the colonial model, China has very cleverly, China being semi-colonized, learned the hard way. So did Thailand. They have these alternate ideas about modernity, and China in particular has alternate ideas of the city. They don't see the city as important as we do. I think they'd see, and this is Li Shichao, not me, he's a very good theorist, he'd see calligraphy or garden design equally as important as the city. And kind of from the courtyard house to the scale of the city, this kind of dogged, rigid planning to all the elements, even the furniture, that held sway till the 20th century. And now they've kind of getting rid of the colonial oppression and being forced to globalize. So the colonial imperial world has vanished. Modernism kind of took its place in the ruins of empire, and then with the colonial elites. But the colonial elites, the British in particular, were very clever at aligning themselves with locals, but the elite locals, who then took over and kept things the way they were. And now what we need to do is kind of, and this is what Alex said, the role of the urbanist or architect or both is extremely important, and that's evolving, and we need to be defining it not only with ourselves as professionals and practitioners, but also with the people who live in these cities. And how do we get to make sure we're speaking the same language? And how do we then educate them in a positive way so they can engage with us, but also educate ourselves about what their needs are? Otherwise we get a Brasilia kind of situation. And then figuring out how to measure what that is. But Esther's comment about the scale is important too, because the scale of the neighborhood is a fantastic scale to be examining and working at, because this is where kind of democratic action comes up with very real issues, 10 minutes from home or whatever. So I think it's very fluid. We have to be very open, and we can then extract our principles and values, but from real cases, from real places, and being open to this.
This bottom-up idea is what we're trying in Indonesia with some success. It's obviously difficult. And it's also, I think it's even more difficult in India. Now we have, luckily, with us, one of these elite locals, which is Anitra. How's your sound, darling? Give me, no, I can't hear you.
I use
Can you hear me now?
Yes, great.
the minute of silence just to say goodbye and answer your question about the two things I meant is that not projects but instruments is the future literacy lab. I think that's UN Habitat if I'm not mistaken. And Polis,
Oh, yeah.
Pol.is, which is artificial intelligence to find the common among groups of citizens.
Not projects, but
I would say instruments, or not projects in the sense of what you described as
defined a finite project, but instruments.
Instruments rather, of engaging, of.
We're going to pick up on that in your absence.
The apologies for.
No, wonderful to see you. Absolutely.
Thank you. Bye.
So there's a few items then on your plate, Anitra. I'm more critical. I don't know. Does that work? This idea of projects versus instruments. I don't know if that's relevant in India. And also, it seems to me it has followed the Chinese model almost to the letter with this ambition of 100 eco-cities. At the same time, there's a huge momentum at the grassroots level, the villages, etc. So in India, it's really where all these issues come to the fore at the same time, right?
So, I mean, a disclaimer, I haven't worked as a planner in India for a while now, and I've kind of transitioned into urban sociology over the last few years. So, not sure if I'm the right person to be on this
You are, trust me.
round table, but yeah, I don't know whether this comparison between India and China still holds. I think India's moved in a slightly different direction. I think I think this momentum to build new cities has kind of fizzled out. I think they tried, but I think they realized that firstly they don't have the money to do that. And so I think the agenda has really shifted to, okay, making cities smarter, whatever that means. But yeah, I mean, there are very few instances of sort of building new cities from scratch in India. I think they tried that with a few new capital cities, or like when capitals were moved, but yeah, there's just a handful of those examples. But I think right now the push is to equip existing cities with better infrastructure and services.
Allow me to interpret what I've been to India twice, and I've been to China really many times. I think, especially in China, the attitude seems to be, okay, so there's India, what's happening there? And then people from Shenzhen pick to Bangalore, oh, is that the Indian rise? Oh, come on, Bangalore, it's a mess. So the Chinese are unimpressed with India. But in the Indian mind, the comparison with China is at play all the time. You know, how do we compare? A kind of semi-inferiority complex, but they want to compare, but at the same time, they know that they cannot make it. But they do adopt the eco-cities, they do adopt the special economic zones. But what I saw is the Chinese plans are always very big. And the Indian plans are always very small. So the special economic zones, they are only a few square kilometers. And in China, they are a few hundred square kilometers, for instance. And the same applies to the eco-cities. Why? Because there is a lot of power fragmentation. And this is cool in Western eyes, but it's a losing strategy in Chinese eyes. And India, on the one hand, correct me if I'm wrong, is proud of its democracy, proud of its checks and balances, but at the same time there is a kind of uncertainty and insecurity looking at the back, but what if it is the wrong way? What if it doesn't help us forward? What if China eventually is so strong it will completely overwhelm us? This is my take on it, and it's because of power fragmentation in India.
Interesting. Anita, we worked in the slums together, and in those days it was difficult, and I personally am very optimistic, or I'm quite impressed anyway, with projects that are happening more recently. New ways of doing slum rehabilitation, etc., etc. Am I too optimistic? I feel there is a grassroots momentum there that we should learn from rather than the other way around.
I think I want to respond to sort of the previous comment before I come to you, Mabel. I mean, yes, I think in the minds of Indian bureaucrats and technocrats and sort of people pumping in money into ambitious projects, yes, I think this allure of Chinese megacities sort of runs high. But, I mean, here in India, you can't sort of ignore sort of ground level social movements, right? Especially against evictions and land displacements. It's something that sort of keeps coming back to derail projects, and that's the reality. And I think that's a very defining feature of urban planning in India. Yeah, so, which is also what makes China and India incomparable. It's the same also with slum redevelopments in Mumbai. There are sort of, I mean, okay, Mumbai is compared to other cities in India, Mumbai is sort of fairly had some success with large-scale redevelopment of slums, but still always within the frameworks of what's possible within this context, where you absolutely must have the buy-in of local residents. And so I think that goes, so that speaks for sort of planning and large-scale urban development. I mean, not just large, but any scale of urban development in India, that I think local buy-in from residents is an absolute must. Yeah.
Well, let me, because I find this example really important and quite fascinating. Like, am I wrong in thinking or observing that the models we have, kind of Western-centric models we have, they are applicable even in a really radical context such as the informal settlements, the slums in Mumbai, but they are then of course adopted, taken apart, and ignored, and that's all fine. It's a messy process, right? But bringing the models with you, like literally physically taking them with you in a box and sharing them on the ground, it seems to be a valid or even a valuable kind of act. Does that make sense to you?
I mean, yes, it's good to have a model that you can replicate, but not every model can be replicated, on the other hand, right? I mean, within the India context itself, the Mumbai model of slum redevelopment cannot be transported to other cities. They've tried, Delhi's tried. It's just not feasible, also because of the local institutions that manage land are very different. They're rooted differently in sort of history and what they're willing to do, what they're not, their approach towards the sort of commodification of land, whatever, all right? So it's interesting to study models, but it's also equally interesting to sort of see why a certain model doesn't fit, cannot be transported even within the same national context. So I don't know whether this sort of debate is so much about Western versus non-Western. I think it's about policy mobility, it's about model mobility, and like what are these structures that make certain models difficult to implement.
Okay, that's okay. That goes beyond what I was thinking, and kind of to Alex's point, like the model just almost like a rhetorical tool, that at least you have a kind of an icebreaker to start with, to start the process. But what do you think?
Yeah, at least they can reject it and you've moved some steps forward. Just some of the problems that cities within the nation state are facing are coming from other nation states. So if you take like Bengal in India and Bangladesh, and the climate and resilience, and there are climate migrants who are seen in the places they go to as economic migrants, but they're actually climate refugees. And in order to kind of solve the problem in India, you have to either do the source back in Bangladesh, or in order to make it better for, so kind of international cooperation needs to be part of this as well, particularly for cities in danger of being flooded, or cities at border areas. I mean, look at now, today, all day is Ukraine being invaded. I mean, now we've got probably another wave of refugees in Europe, and we're still trying to assimilate the Syrians and the Libyans and the Iraqis, and it's just, yeah, so I mean, again, our role in that is not just narrowly top down to us, but to being more open laterally to other places, what's happening, and then the cultures, whether it's Muslim coming to Christian or whatever, defining the role will be very important, and being more flexible.
That kind of brings me back to the earlier point of value, the human-centric value, and I realized maybe I'm too Chinese, because I still tend to think in sort of technological solutions, even spatio-technological solutions. The traditional planner who wants to just draw some roads, right? But that's why I want to come back to you, like the value last time we had a really wonderful talk about this, and you had a lot of angles. How do we grapple with value as a just really pragmatic actor, such as a Chinese planner or a Dutch planner?
Yeah, I think we mentioned the value because when we were discussing about the Chinese context, that I felt that it's a bit needed to help everybody involved in urban planning and development to understand better the issues we are dealing with and how to tackle these issues. But I think if we also talk about other contexts, I think it is more about how we look into the built environment, because it involves two sides. One side, as also Martin mentioned in the beginning, we're dealing with global challenges. These challenges are similar that we see everywhere in the world nowadays: flooding issues, migration, economic crisis. In order to respond to these challenges, actually, it's not only us, urban planners and designers, are solving these issues. We're just part of it. So to respond to these challenges, we need a lot of disciplines to be involved, like sociologists try to understand the social issues, and then from the technology perspective, what are the new platforms we can make use of, and also environmental experts who understand the environment better. So altogether, all these disciplines need to work together in order to understand what is the best future scenario, how to get there. And urban form related to the built environment, it's just part of the solution. In the past, I think, especially the planners, or in the Chinese context, we need to deal with these issues very rapidly, and then we think, well, just by purely working on urban form, we can solve the problem. Actually, we cannot. Sometimes we are contributing to the problems.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's why I mentioned values. Actually, it's not only about value, it's about how can we work with other disciplines and together to try to understand better these issues, the big problems. And these issues are so complex and interwoven with each other. And how can we set priorities? It is a lot of discussion that is needed. That needs to be also aware that the planners and also the authorities, they need to be aware that by changing the built environment of urban form, we're also contributing to the problem solving. So this is one side of the story. The other side of the story is governance. Also, we have been discussed a lot just now. So even if we have a good understanding, it doesn't mean that everybody is in everybody's interests, because there are stakeholders who don't have this interest in the long-term sustainability. They just are interested in the short-term gains, profits, and also what I can have in my territory, including individuals. So it's just I think science in itself, how to work out a good governance to get everybody engaged on board to work together towards a better future sustainability. That's why discussion on values can help with such engagement, so that we can get more people on board to work towards a better future, instead of only looking at their own little interests.
Right. But China is really one of the few places that can think long term and stick to it, right? And just to recap, what you're describing is the model as an imaginary, and it has been using the imaginary so effectively. Eco-civilization, they throw another term every 5 years, another term that is completely undefined, or complete circulation is sort of a macro version of circular economy, and they don't quite know what it is yet, but that's exactly the power of it, because then everybody kind of gathers around and tries to give it meaning. So that could be a model maybe for us in the West as well. My point is, I'm personally very skeptical of terms that don't mean anything. That's what I'm trying to fight against, these principles that are hollow, but maybe they're powerful. I hear you thinking out loud.
Yeah, no, words have meanings and we need to adhere to them. I mean, Trump has just announced his new social media and calls it Truth Social. And in Ukraine, these men are supposed to be peacekeepers, and it's, you know, so we have to agree on what words mean and find co-create the values. It's absolutely essential. I also am in total agreement with you. Some of these buzzwords come out, smart city, whatever, because it's not clearly defined what it is. Everybody thinks they know what it is, and they may be surprised at the end.
I think maybe if I have been emphasizing issues of power before, then here maybe I would like to call for ethics. Most of these terms have an undefined meaning, but actually, if you look at circularity or if you look at eco-civilization, and you are authentically trying to find out what that is supposed to mean, there is something. And it's not what's happening now. What's happening now is using a popular okay term to just continue with the destruction of the planet. That is what we are doing. We're using those okay terms, those eco terms, to do un-eco things and postponing the pain that is inevitably going to come. So if I focused on power before, then I think yes, they are powerful concepts, and yes, our leaders are getting away with it, that's obvious, and everybody else is follow because they want to follow, they want to believe that's going in the right direction, but it's not. So I think we have to call for authenticity here. These are not.
That resonates with what I've been hearing you say, John, about what's happening in Australia. It's the West, but it's not the West. It's a kind of a it's kind of a chimera of the West, right? Is there this kind of bottom-up, community-oriented approach with maybe ideally support from the government? Is it working in your neck of the woods?
No.
Short answer.
I mean, we're probably the West in everything other than geographical location, although there are sort of complexities or there's nuance to that. But there was a comment, I can't remember, I've been keeping notes. I think it was an interest comment about we're proud of our democracy, we're proud of the rule of law and the structures we have in place, but they are in many cases dysfunctional when it comes to addressing the questions that Martin just raised around, a kind of a real and authentic interrogation of what might constitute a sustainable urban practice. And also similarly, where we have a fear of, you can see it in the media, where there's a fear of China, the rise of China, and a kind of hysteria about that, which in fact, and Southeast Asia generally, historically, which means that we tune out and are not accessible, or we're not listening to the kinds of ideas from those places that we might otherwise be sort of paying attention to because they're immediately in our neighbourhood. It's interesting, this conversation. I'm going to change tack slightly, and I'm very interested in this discussion of ideas, the relationship or the sort of pathway of ideas following sort of structures of power, because what I've been doing, apart from, in parallel to my work with Neville over the last few years, has been in really trying to disseminate observations from Southeast Asian and Asian cities back into the Australian context. When we talk about sustainability, one of the major issues in terms of cities is scale, footprint, well, you know, and sort of the total lack of compactness. Australian cities are, you know, incredibly sort of loose in their sort of organisation. They're very low density. Melbourne is half the density on average of Java, the island of Java, like not the cities, like the whole island. So the kind of landscape that Neville's been interested in and we've been interested in over the last few years has been, you know, is, you know, positively metropolitan by comparison to most of the city that I live in right now. So, you know, as a consequence of that, I've been engaged in looking at the sort of the ways in which bottom-up urbanisation and rapid urbanisation has managed to achieve perhaps, you know, arguably far more sustainable outcomes. Sorry, my cat's just walked in front of the computer. And then disseminate those back into an Australian context. And I think the interesting thing about that is I've been running up against, so we talk about the idea of like ideas and behaviours and spatial practices and models kind of moving from, you know, quote unquote Western context back to or into kind of the global South. As soon as you try and do the opposite the other way, you can see very abruptly the sort of the nature of those power structures and the resistance that kind of gets thrown up at that. So I think when we're talking about the transferability of models and ideas, I think it's not only a one-way thing. I think it has the potential to go both ways. And I think also, sorry, I think it's Alex, or whoever was talking about, maybe it was Martin, about the sort of relationship between Shenzhen and the sort of, you know, the tech capitals of India and those kind of back and forth. There's definitely these kind of exchanges that go, you know, across the sort of 4/5 of the world that isn't Europe and the US, is probably, you know, also worthy of study as well, because that's also where those ideas kind of perhaps, you know, there might be some resistance, but they're kind of, the power dynamic is more, you know, certainly far more, well, it was more, you know, nuanced, although that's starting to change with China now over the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm. So South-South collaborations and comparisons.
Yeah, and the other way around, you know, South coming back, so-called South to North. It's a bit strange. I've always found that very strange thing to say, being about as far south as one can be.
Yeah,
but
the
yeah.
global South. I always love to talk about that term.
Right. I want to maybe draw a line in the sand here for a second. I read your point as actually rather optimistic. So it allows me maybe to make a bit of a quick review before we're wrapping up. I asked everybody to bring to the table one example. I don't know if it's feasible, if it's possible. If you have something, Gray, could we start with you? If you have something that we can really distill a lesson from.
It was, to go back to the climate resilience and the cross-border cooperation, there was a student, one of my best students ever at master's level, who was looking at the plight of Bengal climate refugees and came up with a planning strategy that would enable them to have better reception in where they go in Bengal, but also understanding that it's a very often a seasonal thing. So it's not just you go from A to B, it's this kind of over the course of a year or over the course of a life, and how could you then, with their dynamics, have more things for the people left behind to do, the women and children, sort of local crafts, when their land has been inundated by salt water and can not because of a surge and a flood or so with typhoons and so on. So it was, and it had a nice design aspect to it too. I mean, I can send you the link because she's also published. It's been published 2 or 3. There's another version of this appearing in the IIAS newsletter in March, which has got 5 former students from TU Delft who are looking at Asian migrations. So, but this one was a particularly interesting one because of the interrogation of the policy documents, the defining of the terms, the difficulty of explaining that these are refugees and it is climate caused, and then coming up with practical solutions that listened to what they needed on the ground.
That's a great example. It really reminds me of some of the student work that was presented in the IFOU conference with you and Alex. It was quite spectacular, where that's, I don't know how to phrase it properly, but where social spatial solutions were offered that were embedded in both sides intricately and presented really beautifully. So that's interesting. Maybe kids should solve this.
Yeah, that's young minds, yeah.
Yes.
Annie, you just raised your finger, right?
Also, your battery is low.
Oh, that's what you did. Oh, you didn't? And then, well, did you have a concrete example?
Sorry, could you repeat that again, please?
So, just in a sort of a final roundup, are there concrete cases that you feel could bring some clarity to these issues? Maybe cases from India or in general from your work?
Your internet is a bit patchy, so maybe it's mine, I don't know. Can't hear you very well. Could you just repeat that
Neville
again,
is
please?
asking for a good example of idea transfer. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. I don't know, I mean, at the moment I'm trying to do some comparative research, and also we are writing a paper on like what does it mean when we talk about comparative research and breaking away from exactly the sort of the boundaries that John, I think, pointed out that are sort of redundant in sort of furthering the case for comparative research. And I think Jennifer Robinson writes a lot about that. I mean, there's a tendency to constantly compare sort of this idea of developed West with an underdeveloped South, and I think a lot of times those comparisons don't get us anywhere further, not in theory, but also not in sort of understanding sort of practical and pragmatic issues of execution. And so, I mean, okay, cases that are more useful are, I think, then sort of, in my view, like figuring out, okay, what is the essence of what we're comparing, the object of comparison, and then trying to find how sort of you can find that similar essence in another place. So, I mean, I'm not so much for sort of these, comparison for comparison's sake, just based on sort of geographic boundaries. Yeah, I mean, I don't have exact like a specific case study for you. I'm sorry, but okay, but like slum redevelopment, I mean, which is what I study. There are so many factors at play with slum redevelopment, right? I mean, this is a very rigid policy that or a very specific policy that you're studying, and so it kind of almost makes no sense to compare it with a context where, you know, so I don't know how I want to wrap this up, but I would just say that we need a lot more deliberation on like what is it that we're comparing and why are we comparing these two things. And sometimes it just ends up becoming like comparing apples and oranges.
No, your skepticism is well noted, and allow me to make one point. I still felt quite comfortable talking about, let's say, urban dynamics when dealing with slum redevelopment, or at least when arguing against relocation, right? Because then if you do that, the larger urban system actually augments in its sprawl, etc., etc. So I felt there is an interesting angle there, but the what and where, that seems to be really a very good entry point. Who wants to go next? Only a few minutes left.
I can only think of a historical example here. Back to the Netherlands, 18th century. Holland was famous, or the United Provinces were famous for being so modern in the 16th, 17th century. And this led to a kind of complacency where they thought that with their state structures they could handle the world. But the world went on and Holland did not. And then came France in the 18th century. And France invaded. Now this could be seen as bad news. France invading you, Russia invading you, is not doesn't feel right. The luck was, at least in the early phases of the French occupation in the Netherlands, is that Napoleon had a nice brother. It was called Louis Napoleon. And he was banned to the Netherlands. You know, if you had one losing post to go to, it must have been far north, where the dikes were breaking and where the provincial structure was not suitable to fight the water. Now, you would have thought that the Dutch can fight the water, but in those days they couldn't. They were too backward, although they thought that they were forward. And Louis Napoleon was basically turning Holland into a unitary state, uniting the provinces. Still they would kept some of their autonomy, but it became a unitary state, and it was reinforcing the dike structures and forcing the Dutch to see that they were backward. And that some forward-looking people needed to be put in positions of power so that they could lead the country on. And I think, actually now here, Holland is still thinking that we are so much in the lead, but our political system is rotten. It doesn't mean that we need something else than democracy. We do need democracy, but we don't need a self-complacent one. We need one that is powerful again, one that can be self-critical and at the same time is able to take strong measures. Now, you know, if France can send some people, please do. With Russia, I have some more hesitation. But I think self-criticism, and we need to be more self-critical and daring, and the politicians that are now in place, they really need to go.
What I take from that is crisis brings opportunity. Which is a truly deeply Chinese concept, right? It's even in the word itself.
Examples of comparison, I think, first off, I would like to say something about the cross-national comparison as a research method, why we need it, because in my own research group, we also have one research direction on this. It actually came from my previous professor, Mr. Nadine. He supported very much this. His argument is that by doing this, we can also contribute to theories, planning theories. The idea is not to compare pears and apples, but by deepening the understanding and see how similar issues are tackled worldwide, and then also in relation to their own local planning system, we can understand better how different planning systems work. So I think we can see this as a research method, only that we need to know what are the research questions and the aim of this research. The interesting examples, actually I have two in my mind. One is my very long-term interest on housing. It started from my PhD. I came to the Netherlands because of the successful social housing system in the Netherlands. And also my previous professor,
And you saw its decline.
Yeah. So that's why I came to the Netherlands and wrote papers about it, introduced it to China. And now people from China come to learn the Dutch social housing system. But then recent years, I have to tell them, oh, it's a pity here things are also changing. But then by comparing this situation, because social housing used to be also the only choice that we had in the socialist period. So it's interesting to see why situation changed and back and forth. And then this comparison helps us understand what are the driving forces and how the responses from the planning side and the lessons to be learned.
Could you expand a little bit on, when comparing different systems, what are the methodologies that you're using?
We look into the system itself to see whether it is a top-down system or is it a more participatory system. But also we look into the real issues for example, social housing was a tool used since 1901 when the Housing Act has been in place in the Netherlands and in response to housing shortage. And this is similar issues that social housing was used as a tool to tackle some housing shortage. But when it happens in different stages of the development, the issues are actually different. When we use this tool, we should be aware that the type of issues that we're dealing with, and also the type of planning system that we have in each context, and also the phase of development the city is in. So when we talk about housing shortage nowadays, it's a different problem comparing to the post-war period. So we look into both the development trends, spatial development trend, and also the planning system itself.
Okay.
So it's a very
But that sounds to me like just really solid research practice.
yeah.
But then the question remains the implementation side, right? How do
Yeah,
you-
that's why the result is that we shouldn't simply borrow the model, because the model is related to the issue at hand and also the planning system. Yeah, and also the social context. But what can be learned are sometimes are the principles, the values indeed, that we need to achieve social integration, for example. This never change. But the method itself should be different. Depends on what type of houses we're talking about and who will be implementing these projects. Whether it's a cooperation process or it's more top-down, but incorporates the interests of people. Yeah. So by comparing this, we know what to learn, but the model, it depends on how we describe the model.
Okay, got it. That's clear. That's crystal clear, actually. Esther, I hope you are bringing our project to the table, because then I don't have to. And just to in reference to your point, our model is not clear. Our methods are not clear. But we're kind of conscious of that, and the objective has been, please correct me if I'm wrong, but to, in a way, somehow reinvent the wheel and really try to do this kind of tandem bottom-up, top-down, where the big data incorporates the large scale, and then we work, feet on the ground with the community to kind of go bottom-up. But could you reflect on that, Esther, because you're more objective than I am, I think.
But I'm not agree with the big data driven approach, because I feel like we're actually following the traditional way of planning system.
Oh, good.
Doing like mapping and some do the like workshop with the community, but what we're trying to achieve is the bridging the meso scale that can be distilled from the global and also from the local to make some like concrete. But I really agree with what you said about the value chain, because it's the core idea that decide the term and idea and the practices. But I'm just like wondering, because like it's easy to say as a good word, but how can we like measure those, or how to assess in terms of like making the roadmap towards the core for that value? So I'm just like now have a critics on the how to make this value visible inside of the practice.
Okay.
This is a question. Yeah.
So that relates to the narrative, the kind of the rhetorical aspect of the project.
Yeah, it's easy to say as a word, but in terms like policy and involvement and also the like implement into the real place, we need something like that can be visible as a number. I don't know, it's too easy.
Yeah,
Well-
I think we definitely need evaluation system or a kind of framework that we can assess the performance performance of the model, whether it's successful or not. But I think that's another task. Yeah. we need to have that. That is related to the value system, the understanding of sustainability. Yeah.
Sort of key performance indicators.
Sometimes related to the numbers, but sometimes not. I think it's also the acceptance by people.
Yeah, we have discussed that earlier, that it's not so easily quantifiable.
Mm-hmm.
We might need other measurement techniques for certain types of values.
Very true. Well, full disclosure, I haven't actually shared that with you either, Esther. Like, once there, I'm working with this community of people who are really well informed. That's a kind of it shouldn't be a surprise, but it always is, that we had people from national, regional, and local government and the villagers all in one room, locked the door, threw away the key for 3 days, and slowly after a while it became clear that people have bring a huge amount of local knowledge to the table. But then what's lacking is that they're not able to really share. They're not able to act very often. In any case, what I did was abandon everything we worked on for so long, and in a way kind of just started to listen. And that was seemed to be the only way, because the big data didn't communicate. It didn't have that narrative rhetorical power. There's like, oh, here's another foreigner with crazy maps. Oh, that must be smart. No, but that wasn't really what we were after. I wanted to get real feedback from them. So like, okay, let's roll up these big models and not show them again. And that worked really well. And now I'm looking at the kind of the wreckage of 3 days work and a year's work and trying to piece it back together. John, you're very much part of this process in the beginning, but also in the future. Maybe you have
Maybe not if it's wreckage. I might have to step away if it's. It sounds like it's all over. Anyways,
very
sorry,
much.
you were saying?
No, very much. It's some sort of new beginning, because what I think I've learned is that where are the levers that we can pull locally and maybe even regionally, and who are the stakeholders involved that could make a difference and that are interested, what is still missing. So I've kind of mapped out the social landscape a bit more clearly. Yeah.
Okay.
Did you have a way to reflect on these dichotomies that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I had a good think about it, and I came up with something very smart to say, which I've decided not to.
Do it.
I was just reflecting on a few projects as the discussion unfolded, and one of the things that sort of occurred to me that hasn't been mentioned in much detail is the consideration of non-human actors in the design of cities, or the kind of the implementation of cities. Now that, I guess, so that was the first thing I was thinking. I was reflecting on our very brief project from Manila a few years ago, where we looked at a kind of scenario for the inundation of Manila through sea level rise towards 2050, and also the densification of the city, or the increase in population of the same period of time. And the most interesting sort of project or speculation that came out of that was looking at basically an overlay of kind of the pre-settlement mangrove structures that existed there. And although it's sort of a half thought out idea, beginning to look at what, like if one sort of sets aside human-centric planning structures and kind of looks to kind of natural.
That was the end of your bachelor.
That was so predictable. Does anybody have teams that they can call?
Teams. Teams.
I need to see a link. That's so.